This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Bagley.
It's not just some magic that occurs on its own. There is some vector, there's some way that this organism gets moved, and so we're all players in that game.
And the game is moving living things from lake to lake, from river to pond, that really shouldn't be there to begin with. We go inside outdoors with Paul Wilkes to find out more about what's going on in our waterways that for many of us is out of sight and out of mind. All next on Kentucky Afield Radio. For Mother's Day, how many moms would like to go fishing? Well, how about this? Genuine family time with real conversations.
Perfect.
That's more like it. You know, that's what happens when you fish. You catch up on life. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife says, learn more about lakes near your family, stocked and ready to hook memories at fw.ky.gov.
I don't know what you mean by skipper.
Skipper? Skipper! Skipper!
Skipper! Hey, Skipper!
What? Don't skip the life jackets.
Life jackets. You're right. Thanks for the reminder.
Water officers everywhere remind you, your life jackets got your back.
And the backing of everyone that wants you to come home alive.
So, Skipper, don't skip the life jackets. A public service message from your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. So what job do you have? Does what you do actually vary from what's on your job description? Are you a cook? Are you a chef? Are you a culinary wizard? Or are you the king of the kitchen? They all basically say the same thing, just some with a little more color than others. My guest today has such a job title. You look at it and you scratch your head. He is Paul Wilkes, but before we decipher his job title, let's warm up on a few others. Paul, a dream alchemist. Have you ever heard of that?
I have not.
A dream alchemist. That translates to a creative manager or creative director. I don't know if that's in shopping or advertising or what. Field nutrition consultant. That translates to a waitress.
You hear those and you're like, what is that? What does that person do?
Here's one. A domestic technician. To me, that sounds like somebody who does handyman work, but they've listed it here, and these are random things I found on the web, as a housewife. Digital overlord.
Not a clue.
If I just said website manager.
That makes sense.
Makes more sense. Gastronomical hygiene technician. Somebody was reaching for this one. Gastronomical hygiene technician is a dishwasher.
That makes it sound good.
What else? There was one, honestly, at the Department of Parks, back when, this was around 1990 or so. I was friends with the person in advertising there, and I was walking down the hall, and I saw on the door, Director of Golf. That's the job to have. But I got to thinking about it. Is this an easy job? Is this a fluff job? Is this a job you put your buddy into? Or is there really something to it?
Yeah.
You take a look at all the golf courses there are and how they must be maintained and designed, and pro shops and staff and ordering and merchandise and probably a lot beyond that. And I can see why there is a director of golf. So when you take a look at a job like you have, Paul.
Yeah.
The first thing somebody is going to say when they hear the words aquatic nuisance species, is there another word?
Aquatic invasive species coordinator, aquatic nuisance species coordinator, yeah.
Somebody's making that up.
That's what it sounds like.
What's that mean in English?
That's a tough question, and I can see how people on just initially hearing aquatic nuisance species coordinator, you're like, all right, what does this guy do? And you might be surprised to find out I'm actually a pretty busy person. Basically, my role is I'm taking a look at any aquatic species in the state of Kentucky that shouldn't be here, and trying to develop management plans to mitigate the effect that they're having on the environment. And you're like, okay, we have nuisance species in the state. Well, what are they? A lot of you have heard about Asian carp in Kentucky. It's been a big topic as of late. What do we do about the Asian carp? What are they? Where are they? I'm the guy behind all those questions trying to answer them.
Is it easily done?
No, it is not. It is not, as I'm finding out very quickly. Basically, when you talk about aquatic nuisance species, often they're stuff that you don't necessarily see a lot. Why? Because they're living under the water. Asian carp are something people see a little more because we know they like to jump. So if you're just a recreational boater out on the water with Asian carp, you're going to see them. But a lot of your other nuisance species in the state are ones that initially, upon going outside and enjoying a day on the lake, you might not notice off the bat. But we have numerous invasive species, things like hydrilla, curly-leaf pondweed, different stilt and reed grasses, and just a lot of species that aren't native to the state of Kentucky that can be problematic for people trying to enjoy the outdoors.
Are people making more of this than it really is?
Some people think that we're making too big a deal about aquatic invasive species, but the fact of the matter is you can look at other states, you can look at the state of Kentucky, and we have spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort trying to reduce the impact some of these species have on the state. And you ask, well, why are we doing that? And it's because of the havoc that they can wreak on, one, our ability to enjoy the outdoors, our ability to go boating and fishing and spend time on the water, and two, they're hurting some of our native species.
Let's talk about the aquatic environment in general. Now, again, if we're not careful, we're going to make this radio program today very boring, talking about the aquatic environment.
Yeah. Let's
talk about a lake. That's fun. Pond, river, stream. It's more than just water with 2 or 3 fish in it. There's a bunch of stuff living in there, and it all depends on each other. You take something away, that messes with the balance. You put something extra in, that messes with the balance. Talk about what's out there more than just what we kind of perceive as being there.
Okay. That's a great question, and you've really got to the heart of the issue, the real crux of the problem with some of these non-native species. When you go out to the lake, you see, like you said, you see the water, you see, some fish that you're hopefully catching, but what you don't realize is that, okay, if you're out on a lake and you're fishing and you catch a 12-inch largemouth bass, you don't think about the other species that fish interacted with before you caught it. The fact that when that fish was growing up, it fed on plankton, which can be microscopic invertebrates and microscopic algae that it fed on to grow. You don't think about the native plants that it had to hide in to steer clear of predators, and the fact that it took a lot for that fish to get that size. And the major problem with invasive species is they mess up that ecosystem balance that you mentioned. For our native fish, for our native plants, there's kind of a system of checks and balances in the ecosystem. There are things that keep our native fish from replicating out of control and our aquatic plants from just completely overtaking an environment. And the problem with invasive species is when they're coming from a different country or from all the way across the globe and they crash land into Elmer Davis Lake in Kentucky or some other small water body, is they don't have those natural checks. And they have this ability to replicate out of control and just take over an area. And the end result can be in cases that they really limit what our native fish and native plants can use in an area or their ability to grow and reproduce.
You talk about coming from a different country. That's kind of easily done. If you've ever traveled abroad on a ship or airplane, and as you come back to the United States, it will ask you, they will pass out a questionnaire. They want to know, one of the questions they ask you, if I remember this correctly, have you been on a farm? Have you been in mud? Have you been in the forest? And they want to know, do you have any dirt in your shoes? Anything in your cleats? Are you bringing fruits, vegetables in that may not really fit back here in America?
Yeah.
And that's where some of these invasive things come from. Now, it would have to be a little harder to get something that's aquatic because you're not bringing water over there. That would be That'd be harder to do, but nonetheless, it does happen.
Yeah.
Such as Asian carp is a prime example.
You know, you're right. Some of these things, we have a lot of entryways for invasive species to get here in Kentucky. You know, internationally, when you think, historically, international travel and export just wasn't possible the way it is today.
International travel and export. That's an excellent place to pick up when we come back. Paul Wilkes is the guest. He's the Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator for the state of Kentucky. Time now for a quick break. I'm Charlie Baglin. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. Paul Wilkes is my guest. He is the Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator for the state of Kentucky. Quite a mouthful. And before the break, the subject came up that part of the problem is people. Things that we are doing unknowingly, things that we're doing undeliberately, that are helping to facilitate the spread of things that shouldn't be spread. It's easier to do than you think.
If you look online in your local aquarium store, you can say, hey, I'd like some fish for my aquarium, and somebody will ship them to you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can get stuff literally from all over the world just from sitting at home on your computer and purchasing something and having it sent here. And, you know, there are laws and regulations that the government is quickly trying to make to kind of guide that and help certain species to keep from entering the state. And like you mentioned, there's also simpler ways is that, you know, a lot of times when we think about Asian carp or plants or invasive species, and we're like, well, how did this get moved? We always think of it in its adult form, you know? You look at an Asian carp, and it's an 8-pound fish, and you go, how did an 8-pound fish get here and we not notice it? And a lot of this, you don't think about the small stages, you know, the fact that this fish started out as a smaller fish, as a larval fish. You mentioned tracking somewhere with mud on your boots. You're thinking plant seeds, and even some of our aquatic plant seeds can stand a period out of water, can be dry for a little while and still grow when put in a body of water. As aquatic plants are concerned, even an inch or two clipped off of that aquatic plant is all that plant needs to grow and then eventually at some point reproduce.
We ought to go into it right now, then, that people may be at times at fault for moving these things around. You had sent me a note. How to check your boat for invasive species. That's just something I would guess most boaters just never think about.
Yeah. Take, for example, a species, an invasive species that a lot of people know about, like hydrilla. That's an aquatic plant. It's a submerged plant, and it's one that can grow and reproduce very, very quickly.
Describe what's it look like.
All right. It looks like a lot of your aquarium store plants. It's going to have a main stem with a lot of whorled leaves coming off the side, and the leaves are going to be short, maybe less than an inch or so long, and it grows in really, really dense mats. And so it's really easy to move because if you go through one of these mats of hydrilla, which on a lake that has hydrilla, you know it's there. It grows from the bottom of the lake all the way up almost to the surface, typically near shorelines in areas less than 10 to 15 feet deep, and that is going to get stuck on your propeller. It's going to get stuck on your trolling motor. It has a tendency to get caught those places. And especially when you're loading the boat. If you load a boat in an area that has this hydrilla or other invasive aquatic plants, they have a tendency to get stuck between your boat and your boat runner or your trailer runners on your boat trailer. So when you launch that boat, these plants can get caught under there. So initially you're thinking, all right, what's it going to hurt if I move just a small sprig of one of these plants? Well, say you go fish at one lake one day that has hydrilla and you get a little bit of that plant on your boat runner or stuck in your prop, and you move to another lake. That fragment of a plant could actually sprout and grow in a new body of water. So when we talk about moving these things, it's not just some magic that just occurs on its own. There is some vector, there's some way that this organism gets moved. And so we're all players in that game. And there's stuff that all of us can do to look over our boats and equipment and look for these fragments.
So for the nuisance plant of hydrilla, that didn't just blossom overnight. How many years has it becoming a problem? Because there was a time where, it's there, but it's not really a major thing yet. Zebra mussels.
Yeah.
I remember the day. Does this grow quickly?
It does. Hydrilla can grow at an astounding rate. And, what you mentioned is what happens often with the invasive species. We're using the example of hydrilla, is it can get in a small patch and look like it's not that big of a problem, and then just start replicating very, very quickly until it forms those dense mats that are problematic. And, we've seen the problems hydrilla's caused over the past few years, and we've seen examples of states spending millions of dollars just trying to eradicate it once it gets somewhere. The problem with invasives is that usually once they establish in an area and really start to grow and really take a foothold and reach just dense proportions, it's hard to manage them. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of manpower. So the best thing we can do is really work on preventing their spread.
In eastern Kentucky, you'll find a plant that folks are fairly familiar with what it looks like, kudzu, as it drapes over a forest. It's kind of pretty at first sight if you don't really know what it is, but it is smothering the plants underneath it. And I'm wondering if hydrilla is sort of the kudzu of lakes. Is it?
I think that is a great comparison to make. It is very similar in that initially, bass fishermen look at hydrilla, it's in a small patch, they're like, it's good, it's aquatic vegetation that's growing, it's good to fish. But the problem is exactly the same as kudzu. When you look out an area that's covered with kudzu, what's the problem? The problem is there's only kudzu. Everything else has been covered up by the growth of that invasive plant. And that's similar to what hydrilla does. Once it gets in an area, it grows at an astounding rate, and it basically takes over the aquatic plant community in that area. It outcompetes your other plant species. And so that's why it becomes problematic, because it initially started out and didn't look so bad. Looked like, hey, I could catch some fish off this. But the end result is it gets so thick that your larger bass are going to have trouble utilizing that habitat. It's going to be harder for them to forage. It's going to be hard to get your boat through because you've got weeds stuck in your trolling motor. And it just becomes difficult to even use that water body. And I think that kudzu example is a great one.
Bush honeysuckle may be another one. You can't even walk through through some fields in places where the bush honeysuckle is just so thick. Now, it's one thing to be able to go out with a saw and saw down bush honeysuckle and eradicate it to a degree. Can't do that. Can't take a tractor out in a lake. How do you contend with it?
At this point, when hydrilla gets established in dense mats in a water body, the only measures that you can take are very expensive herbicides to try to remove it, but really unless you're committed to spending, and I mean millions of dollars, you're not going to be able to eradicate it.
And $1 million, let's say we had $1 million.
Yeah.
What kind of acreage would that?
If you had $1 million, you might be able to cover a 500-acre lake once or twice a year with an aquatic herbicide suitable to really knock back hydrilla. But again, the key word there is knock back. You're just going to kill it off for maybe one growing season, but it's going to come back. So our department's strategy really is we're trying to prevent the spread through doing things like, okay, we're going to go to just the loading ramp at a lake, and we're going to treat it with an herbicide. So it's less likely that hydrilla is going to get caught up in your boats and your trailers, and you're going to move it somewhere else. You can do things like mechanical removal of hydrilla, but it's extremely expensive and really is just another temporary fix.
You mentioned our department. That's the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, and you are with the Division of Fisheries.
Yes.
Now, I know the Division of Fisheries has money to spend on things other than the eradication of hydrilla, like Asian carp. I mean, you're spending most of your money contending, well, I'm presuming, contending with invasive species versus bolstering sport fish and new lakes and such as that. Am I close to being accurate?
We do spend a good bit of money on aquatic nuisance species, but you ask why we do that, and a key reason is because of the effect on sport fish. It's the goal of the Department of Fish and Wildlife to bolster and increase, outdoor activity. We're providing places and ways for people to enjoy the outdoors, and it's difficult to do that with invasive species hurting some of our fisheries the way they do. So, we have a balancing act. We're trying to spend our money studying, researching, and increasing our sport fish, increasing their habitat. And it was interesting to note earlier this year, the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service discussed the fact that the problem of invasive species rivals habitat loss for one of the most ecological damaging effects on native fishes.
Do you have partners in this, such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, any other of the federal agencies, any other state agencies that are also chipping in to help win this battle?
Yes, we do. We've talked about Asian carp and the problem that they are. A great example of this cooperation is with the Asian carp battle on the Ohio River. Because at this point, with invasive species, it is all about cooperation. That's cooperation between state and federal agencies, and that's cooperation with the agencies and the public, because we all have some role in this fight.
Paul is with us for the rest of the hour. We're talking about Kentucky's aquatic nuisance species. They affect more than just the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but surrounding states and beyond. What's being done to cope? Part of conservation you don't often hear about. Stay tuned. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. Baglan back on Kentucky Afield Radio. If you have ever visited the Salado Wildlife Education Center, sort of like Kentucky's Native Animal Zoo, here's a part of Salado you can have with you wherever you are. The Animal Tracks audio tour talks about the habitats and the wild animals of Kentucky. Just go to fw.ky.gov and click the Salado Wildlife Education Center tab and look for the Animal Tracks audio tour. Make tracks with Animal Tracks, and next time you're at Salado, come prowl a while. For Mother's Day, how many moms would like to go fishing? Well, how about this? Genuine family time with real conversations.
Perfect.
That's more like it. That's what happens when you fish. You catch up on life. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife says, learn more about lakes near your family, stocked and ready to hook memories at fw.ky.gov. This is Charlie Baglan. We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio into our second half hour. If you have dandelions in your yard, then you know the idea of an invasive plant. Kentucky's waterways, our lakes, our rivers and streams, have their share of invasive plants, nuisance plants and animals, versus our native plants. It's one thing to complain about, starlings, another invasive species, but you can see them. But if it's found underwater and it's out of sight, then it's out of mind, at least for most of us. But not my guest, scientist and biologist Paul Wilkes. He is with the Kentucky Division of Fisheries and serves as the state's Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator. Paul, let's get back to a creature many have seen, if only on YouTube, Asian carp, those big fish that'll jump right in the boat with you.
One of the things that's happening right now is that Asian carp are continuing to expand their range. They were originally in small pockets out in West Kentucky and far western reaches of the Ohio River where it meets the Mississippi River. They have moved their range upriver through Louisville. There's limited numbers of them from Louisville to Cincinnati and then a few north of Cincinnati. And so we're trying to slow their spread up the Ohio River. And states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia have said, we really don't want these in our section of the river. What can we do to help you slow their spread? And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, all their state agencies have been working together with us on projects to help us slow the spread of Asian carp up the river. So yes, it certainly is a multi-agency fight.
Are they using those terms? What can we do to slow? Is it a foregone conclusion that, yeah, one of these days they're going to be there?
Some people have that viewpoint. Personally, I don't like to have that viewpoint, because when you say things like, all we can do is slow them, it's just inevitable, people tend towards inaction. I'm an action person. I really hope that we can slow and stop their spread on the river and keep them from getting to some of the habitat that hasn't been as affected by invasive species. And I'm hoping with that attitude that we can get more people on board saying, all right, instead of just saying a task is impossible, let's work at it and see what's possible.
Spent many years in advertising. I learned this. If you want to sell something to a rabbit, first, you better speak to the rabbit in a language the rabbit understands about a subject the rabbit is interested in. That translates to, if you want to sell me or the listening public on something, talk to them in ways that they can relate to, about something that's important in their life. So you take invasive species, things that are there but really shouldn't be. They can see dandelions in their yard. That's another invasive species. They can relate to that. As far as water is concerned, they can relate to Asian carp jumping in the boat. They can relate to getting a snag in hydrilla. Is pond scum, is that in your shop?
Not particularly. There are some invasive aquatic plants that float on the surface that may be in my area, but mostly...
I'm from Carrollton, Kentucky, and every now and then I'll drive up through there, and there's this little boggy area. And I'll look over there, and half of it, anyway, is just covered in pond scum. Yeah. And I'm like, is that natural? Is that supposed to be there? Does it go away on its own?
Some of that is natural, but the problem that a lot of people have with aquatic plants, things such as kind of the pond scum is can be grouped into a lot of different bacteria, the algae that grow on the surface. A lot of what happens is an increased nutrient load. So you have a big farm pond in your front yard, and you fertilize your grass every year, and you put some fertilizer everywhere, and then you cut your grass. Well, the simple thing is you're not just feeding your grass. When it rains, all that water from your front yard, it moves some of those nutrients in the ponds and the waterways next to your house, and that increased nutrient load is in that water, and something is going to grow there and take off and use up that excess nutrients. So, I mean, some of it is natural.
When the nutrients go away, what happens to whatever's grown?
Oftentimes, if you can decrease the nutrient load in a body of water, you will lose a lot of your aquatic plant troubles. Because that's the pinch point. If you've got an area like I'm talking about in somebody's front yard where they got a pond and they're fertilizing year after year, you can use aquatic herbicides and kill the plants in that pond for a year, and you think, well, my problem's fixed. I killed the aquatic plants. If you're still adding tons of fertilizer, adding nutrient load to that pond, those aquatic plants are going to come back. You're just putting a Band-Aid over the problem. You're not getting to the root of the problem. But if you can eliminate some of where those excess nutrients are coming from, then you're going to get to the heart of your problem and really starve off some of those plants.
I'm looking at you, and in front of you, you have what you would call a plan, an aquatic nuisance species plan for Kentucky and for the state. Are you the go-to guy for invasive plants as they occur in water and lakes and ponds?
I'm the go-to guy right now for questions on invasive species. But if you have a question about your pond or your local pond management, that's probably better served by your district biologist. We're kind of in cooperation right now where I'm going to be working on helping them with invasive plant removal problems. Problems like pond scum and issues like that, they have a lot more experience than I do at managing smaller bodies of water and ponds, and they'll be able to provide you with much more information.
As far as the Department of Environmental Protection, Division of Water, Forestry, nature preserves, state parks, anybody else that's out there sort of with their hand in conservation, are you still the go-to guy even though your office is with the Department of Fish and Wildlife?
That's a role I'm kind of coming into at this point. Since this position is somewhat new, we're still working on developing some of these partnerships. You know, our aquatic nuisance species plan at the state level was written in the cooperation with the University of Kentucky biologists and had input from all sorts of folks, from aquatic weed management businesses in the state. We receive feedback from the Division of Water, from the Army Corps of Engineers, just a whole lot of people all coming together to help us figure out the best way to manage aquatic nuisance species in the state.
There's more than just two, I trust.
Yes.
We've talked about Asian carp and hydrilla. What else is on the list?
I guess to get to that, we'd have to first really get into the nitty-gritty of what is an invasive species, because an invasive species is something we consider is more than just a non-native species. It's really a non-native species that's causing a significant problem. And so if you look at our aquatic nuisance species management plan, on that we also list some species that are problematic. Many of you have probably heard of zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are an aquatic nuisance species. There are quagga mussels, very similar to the zebra mussels. You have a host of other plants, different knot grasses. You mentioned things like honeysuckle that can grow in wetlands. Curly pondweed is something that you see in a lot of our local lakes. Again, an aquatic nuisance species. As far as fish are concerned, Asian carp, when we say that, it's kind of a conglomerate of a lot of fishes. It can be any of the Asian carp or grass carp, silver carp, big head carp, and besides the Asian carp, you have things that are potential invasives that we're keeping our eye out for, ones that aren't in the state yet, but we want to make sure that they don't get here, like the snakehead, the round goby. And there's also a few algae. For those of you who are trout fishermen who've been down to the Cumberland tailwater, historically there were some problems with what people call rock snot, which is a kind of a diatom that can grow to proportions that make it difficult to trout fish. And so that's another example. So there's a whole host of these invasive species. Some of them are more high profile than others, but there are certainly a long list.
Paul, you have your work cut out for you. You're relatively new in the position, but there's been a plan in place for a few years, and I presume that people have been dealing with these problems for much longer than your plan has been in place, as a matter of course with their other job duties. Any victories?
That's a very good question. Traditionally, and this is something that I'm working with your district fisheries biologists on, but these guys have been dealing with aquatic plant species as a regular part of their job for years, and they've been doing a great job at it. And we can certainly look at cases where they have been successful at eliminating or taking advantage of environmental issues that have reduced the impact of invasive species. Dewey Lake is a good example out in eastern Kentucky. We had hydrilla that was established there and doing well for years, and it was something we had to, our Eastern Fisheries District biologists had to continually be out there and work on clearing off ramps with herbicides. And after a few years of doing that, his work, coupled with just the right environmental conditions, led to really, so far what we've seen is an elimination of hydrilla at Dewey Lake. We're just not seeing it like we were a few years ago. That's certainly a victory. Another one is just the outreach about Asian carp, the education. From many of you heard about the Carp Madness tournament out in western Kentucky, and just getting people to understand the problem that invasive species cause is a huge victory. And we've additionally, I mentioned a multi-state project on the Ohio River. We have been really working on slowing the spread of Asian carp. We are understanding their biology better. We know where they are now when we didn't know before, and so hopefully we can use that information to slow them down, if not stop their movement up the Ohio.
Look into your binoculars into the future, say 10 years or 20 years. Is it better or worse? What do you see changing?
Optimistically, and we've mentioned how everyone as an individual can play a role in this fight in invasive species. And my vision, what I hope to see in the future, is that everyone is better educated about how aquatic invasive species move. And that sounds like a lot of lingo and jargon, but I see a future where people understand and have seen the problems that species like Asian carp and hydrilla pose, and they pay more attention to what gets moved in the state and keep us from having these problems. And I hope that we reach a point where we have management strategies in place. We have the ability to control and reduce the impact of some of these species that are already established in our state. And we're in a place where we can prevent more of these species from coming into our water bodies.
This is Kentucky Afield Radio, and we're talking about things that live in our water that shouldn't. More in our last segment just ahead. I'm Charlie Bagman, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Bagman, and we are into our last segment on things that live in our waterways that shouldn't. Our guest is the Aquatic Nuisance Species Coordinator for the state of Kentucky, Paul Wilkes. Paul, I've been wanting to say this all hour. You look just like Tim Tebow.
I've heard that comparison a lot, actually.
But let me get your picture here, and we'll put this on Facebook. A Tebow look-alike. There you are.
I've been here. I've done my best impersonation.
We'll get that out there on Facebook, because you have to hear that a lot. You two are the same age. You played any football growing up?
No, I'm a basketball guy, or a wannabe basketball guy is what I guess I should say.
Asian carp. Are there more Carp Madness tournaments scheduled?
We would like to see that happen again, just because of the monstrous success that was, and number one, getting people on board and understanding the problem that Asian carp pose in our big western lakes. But as you mentioned, the funding is one of the limiting factors. So we're hoping on getting some more sponsors on board, and at some point having another Asian carp tournament. It seemed like something really simple to have that, but there was a whole lot that went into that tournament. Not just the prize money, but what do we do with the fish? Getting people to donate freezer space so we can store them and get them used. And, you know, this is funny. A lot of people don't, you know, when you hear the word carp, you don't often think about this, and this is a little bit of a subject change, but these things are good to eat. And so all those, you know, a lot of those fish that we used for that tournament could, you know, they weren't just thrown out or burned, they were found other purposes. That meat and protein was used as fish meal, or I don't know if any of it was used for human consumption, but they are very good to eat. And one of the things we're experimenting with is encouraging processors and people to think about the fact that, hey, you hear the word carp and you think that's nasty. It can't be anything worth eating. But these things they're good carp.
You were on Kentucky Afield TV with Tim Farmer the other day, and was it you that was talking about how to fillet an Asian carp? And
sorry, that was my colleague Dave Baker. He was showing how to fillet one, and that's a great YouTube video to check out. I kind of talked a little bit about their biology afterwards, but Dave did a great job of showing you, all right, it may look intimidating, but really filleting these things is not that bad.
So if you go out there on YouTube, you can find this by searching Asian carp fillet, Kentucky Afield TV. Any of those things ought to bring it up. Your name, Paul Wilkes, and Dave Baker.
Yes.
Or was it David?
It was David Baker. My apologies.
David Baker. And you should be able to find that. They want to actually see that you look like Tim Tebow and hear that nuisance species are legitimate. It's not just a made-up kind of a term to justify a position in state government. But this is hardcore stuff. So, go out there on YouTube, look that up. The fact that Asian carp taste good means that there's hope for the future if you had a commercial fishing industry to come in and sort of take advantage of this. Don't know that you could ever catch all of them, feed everybody, and get rid of them that way, but at least you could sort of keep them at bay. Is that the thinking?
Yeah, that definitely is the thought. You know, we've looked at other states that have really had serious problems with Asian carp. For example, the Illinois River in Illinois has just been flooded with carp. And one of the things that they noticed is kind of pretty intuitive, and that the more carp that are out there, the more problematic they are for your native species and the greater safety concern they pose. So even if we could somehow keep these populations of Asian carp in check, keep their numbers low enough that we'll at least minimize their effect on our native sport fish and increase our boater safety that way, I think that's a win. And so, exactly like you mentioned, even if there's any sort of harvest of these fish, that would at least be helpful in keeping their numbers lower to decrease the impact they'd have.
We started the program talking about strange job titles, and I want to just do that to bring up the subject that even though it sounds made up, if you really don't understand what a title means, it doesn't decrease its significance. Here's a couple other ones. I think if I had the choice, I would want to be known as one of these guys, like go to Best Buy and be on the Geek Squad.
Yeah.
Those guys got it going on. If it's digital, they got it going on. I think the one that really gets the prize is go to the Apple Store and be a genius.
I can handle that title.
People know when you talk about geniuses these days, you're not automatically thinking Albert Einstein. You're thinking the dude at Apple. That's a genius. And I look at you, you're the genius of Aquatic Nuisance Species. Even though you don't know what that is.
That's a title I hope to aspire to. I'm certainly not there yet.
if you love water and good water quality and great places to swim and boat and fish, then you'll be thankful that Paul Wilkes and his efforts are out there in Kentucky. Do you text and drive?
No.
Good for you. I appreciate you coming by, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed it, and I hope everybody gets some good chances to enjoy the outdoors this spring.
We have that photo of Paul already posted to Kentucky Afield Radio's Facebook page. If you haven't liked us yet, just search Kentucky Afield Radio in the search box. It's an unreal resemblance. Couple of minutes left in the show, and time for something we have not done in a while, a good dog story. We have a story here of an adopted dog who has proven his worth and then some. We get the story from ABC's Good Morning America.
Duke is an ordinary-looking dog who did something extraordinary.
He's such a good boy.
Last Sunday night, Duke jumped on his owner's bed and started shaking so uncontrollably he woke them up.
He is insanely obedient, so this was extremely bizarre.
So bizarre, in fact, that Jenna Brousseau immediately knew something was wrong. This prompted her and her husband to go check on their 9-week-old infant daughter, Harper. Sure enough, something was horribly wrong. Harper wasn't breathing.
My husband called 911, and the ambulance came here, and it was because of our Dookie dog who alerted us.
Duke's call for help saved the little girl. Harper is now doing just fine.
If Duke hadn't, been so scared, we would have just gone to sleep.
The Brousseaus adopted this scrappy little dog from an animal shelter 6 years ago, a debt of gratitude that has now been repaid many times over.
He's the perfect dog. He was meant to be ours. I tell him all the time, you were born in Mommy's heart. And just because he was so meant to be ours. He's heaven. He's a good boy.
A cat would have slept right through that. It just shows to Goya what I've always said. There is nothing better than a dog. We are out of time. I'm Charlie Baglin, inviting you to join us in a week, and we will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.